Texas has executed more people than any other state in America. But did you know only a handful of women have ever faced that same fate? Right now, just 5 women sit on Texas death row, each convicted of crimes so shocking they shook entire communities. Their stories are filled with betrayal, violence, and unimaginable horror, and all of them are waiting for the same ending: death by lethal injection. Before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new true crime story. Darlie Lynn Routier. It was a quiet night in Rolette, Texas, June of 1996, when police received a frantic 911 call. On the other end of the line was a young mother, screaming, panicked, telling the dispatcher that an intruder had broken in and attacked her children. When officers rushed to the Routier home, they found a scene that was almost too brutal to process. 2 little boys, Devin, just 6 years old, and Damon, only 5, lay bleeding from multiple stab wounds. Their mother, Darlie Lynn Routier, also appeared injured, a slash across her neck and cuts on her arms. To neighbors and first responders, it looked like a horrific home invasion. But as detectives combed through the house, something about the story began to unravel. The kitchen sink had been wiped down. A window screen was cut, but investigators believed it had been staged. And despite Darlie's claims of a violent intruder, there were no signs of forced entry beyond what appeared to be self-inflicted staging. The question shifted quickly. Was Darlie a victim, or had she committed the unthinkable? In the weeks that followed, prosecutors built a chilling narrative. They argued that Darlie, overwhelmed by stress, debt, and the pressures of raising children, had turned on her own family. They pointed to blood spatter evidence, the lack of an intruder's trail, and her demeanor caught on tape. At one of her son's grave sites, she was filmed spraying silly string during what prosecutors painted as a celebration, footage they used in court to suggest a woman without remorse. The defense countered fiercely, insisting that Darlie was innocent, that she loved her children, and that the silly string footage ignored the somber memorial just minutes earlier. They emphasized her injuries, which they claimed showed she had fought off an attacker. Supporters rallied behind her, saying investigators rushed to judgment and overlooked the possibility of a true intruder. But in 1997, a Dallas County jury returned its verdict, guilty of capital murder. Darlie was sentenced to die by lethal injection, the standard method of execution in Texas. Decades later, her case remains one of the most controversial in the state. Appeals and DNA testing have been pursued again and again, with her supporters claiming there are still unanswered questions, that justice may have been misserved. Yet to this day, the official record holds her accountable for the deaths of Devin and Damon, 2 little boys whose lives were cut far too short. The Routier case leaves a chilling imprint, not just because of the brutality of the crime, but because it forces us to confront a haunting possibility. What if the courts got it wrong? Or what if they got it exactly right? Either way, the tragedy of 2 innocent children remains, and the shadow of that June night still lingers. And Darlie Lynn Routier is not alone on Texas death row. Another woman's crime would stun the state for its cold calculation. Not a mother's home, but a babysitter's silence. Silence forever. Kimberly Cargill. In the summer of 2010, the small town of Tyler, Texas, was rocked by a crime that felt both calculated and cruel. Cherry Walker, a quiet, kind-hearted woman with special needs, had gone missing. She wasn't someone who disappeared without a trace. Cherry was dependable, gentle, and known in her neighborhood for her sweet demeanor. When she failed to return home one night, alarm bells rang immediately. Hours later, firefighters discovered her body on the side of a rural road, engulfed in flames. What at first looked like a tragic accident quickly revealed itself as something far darker. Investigators determined that Cherry had been doused with lighter fluid and set on fire. But the question that haunted detectives was why? The answer pointed straight to Kimberly Cargill, a single mother entangled in a bitter custody battle. Cherry had been subpoenaed to testify in court about Cargill's parenting, testimony that prosecutors argued could have cost her custody of her child. According to investigators, Kimberly saw Cherry not as a friend or a vulnerable neighbor, but as a threat that needed to be silenced. The prosecution painted a chilling picture during the trial. a woman willing to cross the ultimate line to protect herself, even if it meant extinguishing an innocent life. They described how Cargill lured Cherry out of her home, strangled her, and then tried to erase the evidence in flames. The defense fought to humanize Kimberly, suggesting she was overwhelmed, desperate, and not the cold-blooded killer the state portrayed her to be. But the jury was unmoved. In 2012, Kimberly Cargill was convicted of capital murder. The sentence, death by lethal injection. Cherry Walker's death shocked, not just because of its brutality, but because of what it represented. A life taken not in a fit of rage or a chaotic crime of passion, but in a deliberate attempt to silence a voice. Cherry was vulnerable, trusting, and defenseless, and the betrayal cut deep for her family and community. Today, Kimberly Cargill remains on Texas death row. Her appeals exhausted, her name etched among the very few women sentenced to die in the state. For many, her case is a reminder of how fear and desperation can twist into something monstrous, and how justice, though slow, sought to speak for Cherry when she no longer could. But Kimberly is not the only woman awaiting execution in Texas. Another name looms large, a foreign-born woman whose case made international headlines, accused of orchestrating a plot that ended with a young mother dead and her newborn baby stolen. Linda Carty. In May of 2001, Houston police were called to a chilling scene. 25-year-old Joanna Rodriguez was found dead, bound with duct tape and stuffed into the trunk of a car. Even more disturbing, her newborn baby had been taken. The discovery sent shockwaves through the city, and as investigators unraveled the case, all eyes turned toward an unlikely suspect, Linda Carty, a British-born woman and former schoolteacher's aide. According to prosecutors, Carty had orchestrated the entire plot. Desperate to have a child of her own, she enlisted 3 men to help her kidnap Joanna and her infant son. The plan was as cold as it was shocking: abduct the young mother, silence her, and keep the baby as her own. The state argued that Carty played the mastermind, manipulating others to carry out the violent scheme while she remained behind the scenes pulling the strings. The trial in 2002 was swift and unforgiving. Witnesses testified that Carty had promised gifts and money in exchange for help with the abduction. Prosecutors said she had posed as part of a fake drug raid to gain access to Joanna's home, ultimately leading to the young mother's death. The baby, thankfully, was found alive, but Joanna's life had been cruelly cut short. For the jury, the evidence was damning. Linda Carty was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death by lethal injection. But her case didn't end there. Because she was a British citizen, her conviction drew international attention, with the British government and human rights organizations questioning whether she had received a fair trial. Supporters argued that her court-appointed attorney failed her and that key witnesses had motives to lie. Yet despite the protests, her appeals have been denied, leaving the original sentence intact. Today, Linda Carty sits on Texas death row, one of only a handful of women facing execution in the state. To some, she is a manipulative killer who plotted the unthinkable. To others, she is a woman caught in a flawed justice system, her case clouded by doubts and diplomatic controversy. Either way, the heart of the story is the same: a young mother murdered, a child stolen, and a community left haunted by the crime. And Linda is not the last name on Texas's list. Another woman has waited decades in near silence. Her crime, dating back to the early 1990s, a case of robbery turned deadly that would put her on the path to the execution chamber. Erica Yvonne Shepard. In the summer of 1993, Houston police were called to an apartment that bore the unmistakable signs of violence. Inside, they found the body of 43-year-old Marilyn Sage, brutally murdered. What unfolded in the days after would link the crime to a young woman named Erica Yvonne Shepard, a teenager at the time, whose life would take a turn from petty trouble to capital murder. According to prosecutors, Erica and an accomplice targeted Marilyn during a robbery. Investigators said the attack was vicious, involving blunt force and multiple stab wounds. Items from the apartment were stolen, and the state painted the crime as not just opportunistic, but senselessly cruel. The brutality shocked even seasoned detectives, who described the scene as one of the most disturbing they'd witnessed. When Erica was arrested, she was barely 19 years old. In court, the prosecution argued that she had willingly participated in the killing, showing no hesitation in carrying out the violence. The defense countered with a very different picture: a young woman manipulated and dominated by her accomplice, someone who lacked the power to stop what was happening. They tried to cast her less as a cold-blooded killer and more as a frightened follower caught in over her head. But the jury wasn't convinced. In 1995, Erica Shepherd was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death by lethal injection. At such a young age, she became one of the rare women to be placed on Texas death row. And there she has remained for decades, appeal after appeal, delayed, denied, or dismissed. Her case has drawn occasional attention from activists who argue that her upbringing, marked by hardship and instability, was never fully considered. They claim her youth and vulnerability at the time of the crime make her death sentence especially harsh. Still, the state has held firm. The crime was too brutal, the evidence too strong. Now, more than 30 years later, Erica Yvonne Shepherd is one of the longest-serving women on Texas death row. Time has passed, but her name remains on the list of those awaiting execution, her case frozen in a limbo between punishment and resolution. And while Erica's decades of waiting are extraordinary, another case would erupt much more recently, a crime so shocking it gripped headlines around the world. It involved a pregnant mother, a stolen baby, and a killer who showed no mercy. Taylor Renee Parker, October 2020. The quiet town of New Boston, Texas, was shattered by a crime that seemed ripped from the darkest corners of a nightmare. 21-year-old Reagan Hancock, heavily pregnant and just weeks away from giving birth, was found murdered in her own home. She had been beaten, stabbed more than 100 times, and left to die on her living room floor. Her unborn child had been cut from her womb. Police scrambled to make sense of the brutality. The horror deepened when they learned that the baby girl had been taken. Within hours, officers stopped a woman speeding toward Oklahoma. In the passenger seat was an infant, barely alive, covered in blood. The driver was 29-year-old Taylor Renee Parker. Prosecutors would later reveal a chilling motive. Taylor had spent months convincing her boyfriend, her family, and her friends that she was pregnant. She staged sonograms, shared baby updates, and even faked a due date. But when the day arrived and no baby came, the lie began to collapse. Faced with exposure, Taylor took the most unthinkable path, targeting a young mother she knew, killing her, and stealing her child in a desperate attempt to keep her deception alive. At trial in 2022, jurors listened to the gruesome details with visible shock. Witnesses described Reagan as a joyful, kind-hearted woman, excited to welcome her second child into the world. Instead, her life was cut short by someone she trusted. Prosecutors called Taylor manipulative, cold, and remorseless, a woman who planned the crime with precision, even searching online for how to perform a C-section at home. The defense tried to argue that Taylor's life was marked by trauma, abuse, and mental health struggles, that she was more than the sum of her crime. But the sheer savagery of what had been done to Reagan and the calculated way it unfolded left little room for mercy in the eyes of the jury. In November 2022, they sentenced Taylor Parker to death by lethal injection. The case still reverberates, not just in Texas, but across the country. It is remembered as one of the most disturbing crimes in recent memory. The destruction of a young mother's life, the theft of her child, and the shattering of two families. For many, the name Taylor Renee Parker is synonymous with betrayal and cruelty, a reminder of how far some will go to preserve a lie. And so she waits on Texas death row, the newest among a small handful of women sentenced to die in the state. Her presence there closes a list marked by desperation, violence, and tragedy, 5 women whose names will forever be tied to Texas's harshest punishment.